Okay, so here's another slide on Clostridium difficile. But don't forget, a lot of this can be thought of as other bad bacterial infections um, of the bowel, right? So dehydration, well, that's just from the severe diarrhea. Kidney failure. Well, remember, if you're losing a lot of fluid, you're getting dehydrated, your blood pressure is dropping, and you're not perfusing your kidneys, so you're getting a pre-renal acute kidney injury. Okay, so you can go into some renal failure. Colitis. Well, colitis is just inflammation of the colon. So Clostridium difficile can lead to colitis. Many of the other bacterial infections, Campylobacter, Shigella, they can also lead to a colitis, inflammation of the colon. Pseudomembranous colitis, we kind of leave that for Clostridium difficile. So it's the colon wall is just filled with inflammation. It looks like raw beat up meat. It's inflamed, it's bleeding, it's got white streaks of pus on it. That's pseudomembranous colitis. Toxic megacolon is where the colon gets so dilated because of all the gas that's being produced from Clostridium difficile, and it's built up in creating this incredible distension of the colon. And finally, what's going to happen? The bowel will perforate, and you'll get a hole connecting the colon to the peritoneum. And if that happens, well, definitely a complication of peritonitis is death. Okay, so this is just these are just images of bowel obstructions. The one on the left is a large bowel obstruction. So if you can imagine where the large bowel is supposed to be, you can see that there's distended loops of bowel filled with gas. There's what are called air fluid levels, which are these horizontal levels of fluid within the colon. Don't worry if you don't see it, it's totally fine. So on the right is a small bowel obstruction. So the small bowel is more centrally located. And again, you have dilated loops of bowel. I don't see any air fluid levels on this particular one. You don't always have to see them, but just notice how distended the small intestine is on the right and the large intestine is on the left. Okay, so let's talk about bowel obstructions. So a bowel obstruction is where something has either blocked the lumen of the small bowel or the large bowel, or there's been a twisting of a loop of bowel, and because of the twisting, the contents within the bowel can't continue on. So there's nothing in the lumen, but it's twisted on itself, so the lumen is blocked. There's something on the outside that's pressing on the bowel and blocking it. So say you have some kind of huge mass in your abdomen, some kind of cancer that's pressing on the bowel, that could give you a bowel obstruction. So there's many different causes of bowel obstructions, but some are definitely more common than others, and we'll get to the common ones. Okay, I have small bowel obstructions and large bowel obstructions. Okay, let's just so whether it's large or small, just think, okay, there's something that's stopping the flow of the fluid in the small bowel, if it's a small bowel obstruction, or in the large bowel if it's a large bowel obstruction, and they behave slightly different. So in the small, if you have a small bowel obstruction, let's give an example of a man comes in and he's got a huge lump in his groin because he has a hernia, and there's loops of small bowel in that hernia, and they're compressed. and it's not reducible. So he has a small bowel obstruction. Fluid cannot continue to flow. So you have abdominal discomfort, okay? You often have crampy upper abdominal discomfort. You can get some distension of your abdominal wall. So if your abdomen's usually flat, you can get a bit of a bloated abdomen because there's no fluid flowing past the obstruction. So you can get a bit of gas buildup and fluid buildup behind it. So a bit of distension. You're very nauseated and you have very early profuse vomiting. And why do you have profuse vomiting? Well, the fluid can't go forward. And there's no problem going backwards. It'll go back all the way to the stomach. It'll fill the stomach, and then up it comes out your mouth. Okay, so profuse vomiting is a very common finding in a small bowel obstruction. Some mild abdominal distension is common. Abdominal cramping because the small bowel is going crazy, trying to contract and move the fluid along, but it can't. Obstipation means no bowel movements. Okay, so your bowel movements are going to come to an end because there's no fluid continuing on down past the obstruction. So you might have a bit of a bowel movement just in the time around the bowel obstruction, but hours to days later, there won't be any more bowel movements because nothing is flowing. Severe fluid and electrolyte imbalance. Well, for sure, because you're vomiting up all the nutrients, all the electrolytes that was in your small bowel and your stomach, and you have large amounts of vomiting. There's no valve that's stopping it. Metabolic alkalosis because of all the acid that you're vomiting up from your stomach. Okay. Look at large bowel obstruction. So lower abdominal crampy pain. So the large intestine tends to be a bit of a lower down structure, especially the sigmoid and the rectum. So you have lower abdominal pain. You have lower abdominal distension. So the large bowel is where you can have massive amounts of abdominal distension and bloating because when you're obstructed in the large bowel, so air fills because bacteria is producing gas, and it often can't go forward past the blockage, and it can't go backward because of the ileocecal valve. So you get this massive abdominal distension, okay, in a large bowel obstruction. You don't tend to have a lot of vomiting because of the ileocecal valve. So there's not a lot of backflow into the small intestine, okay? You're definitely uncomfortable though with all the bloating and distension that you have. Obstipation, for sure. You're not going to be having bowel movements after a large bowel obstruction because there's nothing flowing forward into the rectum and out the anus. Major fluid electrolyte imbalances, not really, because you're not vomiting out fluids. You're not losing tremendous amounts of fluid. So it's not like you're going to get a lot of electrolyte changes. Metabolic acidosis. So why would you get that? Why would they add that to this list other than just adding to the pain that you have to remember? Well, if you have a large bowel obstruction, so the fluid, the colon can hold a lot of fluid, okay? So there's fluid that's filling the colon from your bloodstream, okay? A lot of it's not being reabsorbed, and you can basically what's called third spacing. So you're holding fluid within the colon. It's not moving forward, it's not moving backward, but remember the colon is 5 feet long. It can hold a lot of fluid. So you can get basically a pre-renal injury where you're not able to clear your acids out your kidneys. So you can get a bit hypotensive, and you're not clearing, you're not perfusing your kidneys as well. So you can run into a metabolic acidosis because of that. Okay, it's not a huge, of all of the ones that we just listed, that's not a huge one. Okay, that's not a huge symptom is what I meant. Okay, so let's look at some of the causes of obstruction. So the first one, A, that's just trying to show you adhesions. So adhesions are just scars around the intestine, usually the small intestine, and they're from previous surgeries that you've had. So if you've had abdominal surgery of any type, you're at risk for getting a bowel obstruction later in life because there's going to be some degree of scarring. There's less scarring with laparoscopic surgery, but there's still some. Okay, so adhesions where a loop bowel can twist on the scar, and then once you've twisted a loop of bowel around an adhesion, now you have a bowel obstruction. Okay, or a small intestine obstruction. The next one, B. Well, it's usually the small intestine that goes into a hernia. So if you have a strangulated hernia, or what's called a non-reducible hernia, well, that's going to give you a small bowel obstruction too. Okay, so suddenly the tube is blocked because it migrated into this hernia and nothing can flow because it's all compressed and turned on itself. C is a condition called intussusception, where a loop of bowel telescopes within itself. This is common in children, okay? And D is kind of referring to the same thing, intussusception. So the bowel is telescoping within itself, and what happens is behind it you get a bowel obstruction because as the telescoping continues, it finally just nothing is flowing through. So you get a bowel obstruction behind it, and where the telescoping has come to an end, you can have an infarction of the tissue or ischemia of the tissue because there's no blood supply getting to the end of where it's been telescoped. So often with intussusception, it's a child that develops a bowel obstruction. They have blood in their stools because the part that's telescoped isn't getting any blood supply. So there's bleeding. We call it red jelly or currant jelly stools of intussusception. And the other thing to remember with intussusception, not necessarily for this test, is that children present with bowel obstruction, bloody stools, abdominal pain. They often have to bring they bring their knees up to their abdomen and they hold them there to try and relieve the discomfort they're having. And the other thing is these children present with, and we don't know why, profound fatigue with this condition. They're out of it while it's happening, and we just don't know why. Something's being released into the bloodstream, or not sure. D is basically intussusception. It's just showing you something that's on the bowel wall that's pulling the bowel forward and telescoping it. It's the same idea as intussusception. E is what's called mesenteric ischemia. Ischemic bowel is another term for it, and it's when a portion of the bowel doesn't get any blood supply and it just won't have any peristalsis anymore. It'll stop having peristalsis. So it's not a true bowel obstruction in the sense that you're thinking, oh, there's something blocking the passage. But if you don't have peristalsis, then the fluids in the food and the flow will stop, and we'll get to a condition that specifically deals with that. So just because you have the bowel there but it's not working because it's not getting blood supply, that can cause a bowel obstruction just by not being able to move the fluid forward. F is a growing colon cancer. So when that colon cancer finally gets right across the lumen and blocks the lumen, you'll have a large intestine obstruction. And hopefully you get a symptom before you get obstructed, because usually the tumor's grown very large by then. So hopefully you get a bit of bleeding or something else that'll make us suspicious to check for colon cancer. And G is what's called a volvulus. It's where part of the large intestine twists on itself, and this can happen at the sigmoid, and it's called a sigmoid volvulus, and it can happen at the cecum, and that's called a cecal volvulus. And once it twists like that, you need urgent surgery to untwist that. Otherwise, that entire portion that's twisted will die. Okay, so A, B are small intestinal obstructions. So adhesions and strangulated and a hernia, those are the most common. C, intussusception, that happens in children. That can cause a bowel obstruction. And then E can be a small intestine or large intestine. I wouldn't spend too much time with ischemic bowel. F and G are definitely large intestinal issues, colon cancer and a volvulus. Okay, so again, talking about obstruction, signs and symptoms just depends on where the obstruction is. So if it's in the small bowel, as mentioned, now that you've seen a couple of diagrams and we've spoken about it, it's either from adhesions from a previous surgery or from a strangulated hernia that cannot be reduced, and that would be an immediate surgical intervention for a strangulated hernia. So central colicky, crampy pain, profuse, frequent vomiting, because the small intestine wants to decompress itself over and over again. So you can see how you can get dehydrated very quickly from all this vomiting. You can have a bit of passage of stool initially, because don't forget you have stool beyond the bowel obstruction when you develop the bowel obstruction. So you could have a bit of stool initially, and then you don't have any stool after that. Your colon becomes empty. Mild abdominal distension because you're decompressing every time you vomit, okay? Compared to a large bowel obstruction, which the most common causes would be a colon cancer or a volvulus, so the twisting of a large section of the colon. Crampy abdominal pain, no bowel movements, because usually, so you're twisting and something's happened in the colon, so beyond the obstruction there's probably not much stool. So I would almost think about it as you might have a bit of stool with a small bowel obstruction. With a large bowel obstruction, probably not going to have much bowel movements or stool once you have a large bowel obstruction. Massive distension, because the gas has nowhere to go. It can't go forward and it can't go backward. So those are the differences. You don't typically get huge amounts of vomiting with a large bowel obstruction compared to a small bowel obstruction. Okay. And so what do we do with bowel obstructions? Well, we're not going to give people things to eat and drink. It's just going to come back up. So they're MPO. Nasogastric suctioning. Well, sometimes put a tube into their stomach to suction out the fluid, and sometimes also the air that's being built up. And it helps with reducing the amount of vomiting that they're having too. Analgesics for the abdominal pain. And often a surgical consult is required, especially for certain conditions like a volvulus, a strangulated hernia, an obstructing bowel cancer. They need to be operated on. Okay. Other conditions such as adhesions, they often resolve on their own. So if someone comes in with a small bowel obstruction from adhesions, we'll often give them a day or two for the bowel to work itself out first before doing any kind of surgical intervention, which is just going to cause more scarring. Okay, so what's paralytic ileus? So this is usually a post-surgical issue where you've had surgery on your abdomen, your bowels have been manipulated, and now they've just turned off. they don't want to have any peristalsis. They've just taken a break because they've been touched. Okay, so peristalsis stops in the intestines. So it's not like you have a twist anywhere, or there's an obstruction in the lumen. It's a functional obstruction, meaning things just aren't going to flow after you've had surgery, and that's why we put people on NPO initially, and then once we hear some bowel sounds, we'll start them on some clear fluids to see if they can tolerate clear fluids, then build them up to full fluids, and then a full diet. And that's why people typically don't go home until they're drinking fluids, because we don't want to send them home with a paralytic ileus. Okay, so sedation, anesthetic, abdominal surgery. The other category that you can get, so that goes all together. So basically surgery, abdominal surgery is where you can often get a paralytic ileus. The other part is if you're incredibly ill with, say, sepsis, or some other severe illness, say you've been in a major trauma or a burn, well, your bowel will turn off then as well, because your bowel says, you know what, you're much sicker, you need to divert energy elsewhere, I'm going to turn off. And you can get a paralytic ileus from sepsis or a major burn. So, it's not uncommon that we might see someone who comes in really sick and we think they have a bowel obstruction as well, but it's actually just the bowel has turned off temporarily from a paralytic ileus. Okay, so what about peritonitis? So around your bowels, you have a very fine wrapping, almost like a saran wrap that surrounds your bowels and your stomach, and there's a peritoneal cavity, and it's usually completely sterile. There's nothing in it. There's no bacteria in it at all. There might be just a bit of lubricating fluid, but typically it's quite empty. And peritonitis is when you get typically a bacterial infection and inflammation of the peritoneal cavity. Okay, and it's a very serious condition. Okay, so a primary peritonitis, meaning it traveled there from your blood, would be almost unheard of. That would be very strange. Usually you get peritonitis secondary to another illness that you had. So, for example, you have a gastric ulcer and it perforated through to your peritoneal cavity. Or you had a very aggressive Clostridium difficile illness and you had a large bowel perforation. Or you ignored the right lower quadrant pain of appendicitis and it finally perforated into your peritoneal cavity and you now have peritonitis. So bacteria and inflammation of the peritoneal cavity is peritonitis. And people are very sick with this, okay? I think that's it for this slide. Okay, so let's do this question together. What type of bowel obstruction is formed from scar tissue due to previous abdominal surgeries? Well, that's going to be adhesions, right? So every time somebody has abdominal surgery, there's going to be scarring occurring, okay? There's just no way around it because the scalpel cuts into tissue. It goes through the peritoneum to get to the abdominal cavity, and in the healing process the body forms scars, and that makes that patient prone to potential twisting of the small intestine around a scar, leading to a bowel obstruction. Okay, ischemic bowel, what's that? Well, that's loss of blood supply to a section of the bowel. That is really serious. Okay, so it's either from a clotted artery that's feeding blood to a certain section of the bowel, or it's from an embolus, so a clot that has traveled somewhere else. And a potential cause of an embolus is atrial fibrillation. right? Atrial fibrillation can throw off little clots, and if they don't travel to the brain and cause a stroke, they can travel anywhere in the body. And one of them is into one of the intestinal arteries, leading to ischemic bowel. And a patient with ischemic bowel usually comes in with severe abdominal pain. We can't find much on examination, but they are really in misery. Okay, so typically we'll have to go looking with a CAT scan or a CAT scan with dye to see if we can find a blockage of one of the arteries to the intestine. Otherwise, what'll happen is that part of the intestine will necrose and die, and it'll break open, and they will have peritonitis. And after you get peritonitis, death is pretty close. Okay. A strangulated hernia, that's a cause of a bowel obstruction, but it's not due from previous scars. It's due to the fact that parts of our abdominal wall can allow bowel to herniate through them, such as in the groin or the umbilicus. And as the bowel herniates through the hernia, it can twist and cause a strangulated hernia, and that's causing a bowel obstruction, right? Because it's twisted and there's no ability for food or fluid to continue on its route. A volvulus is a huge twisting of the large intestine. Okay, so the large intestine has twisted on itself, and that's a surgical emergency as well, because when the large intestine twists, it also twists the arterial supply to the entire part that's twisted. So they're going to get ischemic bowel to the whole section, and on top of that, they have an acute bowel obstruction. Okay? So anyways, the answer here is adhesions.